If you look at the glittering skyscrapers of Shanghai today, or China's relentless grip on the global economy, you are looking at the dream of a man who was once forbidden from even setting foot in Beijing. This is the story of Deng Xiaoping, a politician who was purged, slashed, and erased from the structure of power 3 separate times. Yet every single time he rose like a phoenix from the ashes of exile or prison to save China from the madness of Mao Zedong's policies that had left a nation drowning in poverty and starvation. He was a man only 150 centimeters tall, barely 5 feet. Yet today, his shadow looms over every major economy on Earth. He didn't care for socialist paradises or grand revolutionary slogans. He was a cold, hard realist who, in the midst of famine and misery, turned a simple sentence into a new religion for 1 billion people. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. But how did an old man, whom the system tried to destroy time and time again, end up becoming the savior of that very system? History is in the headlines. But the truth? That's hidden in the profiles. Welcome to Profile. Subscribe to join our community of curious minds. Deng Xiaoping was born in 1904 into a middle-class family. At 16, he boarded a ship for France. This wasn't a traditional study abroad trip. It was part of a government work-study program designed to send young Chinese to Europe to labor, learn, and bring back the advancements of Western civilization to their homeland. Deng worked in French factories, at Renault, in the steel furnaces. His hands were scarred, and his stomach was often empty. But in the cafes of Paris and small circles of Chinese migrants, he found something no factory could give him: ideology. In 1922, at 18, he joined the Communist Youth League. When he returned to China in the late 1920s, he transformed from a political activist into a hardened military commissar. During the Long March, he learned his first lesson in survival. In 1933, he was stripped of his posts for supporting Mao Zedong's strategies against the party's pro-Moscow hardliners. This was his first fall. But Deng had a special kind of patience. He stayed in the shadows, waiting for Mao's rise to bring him back to the high command. With the 1949 revolution and the birth of the People's Republic, Deng was called to Beijing to be the executive director of the party. By the mid-50s, he was general secretary, the second or third most powerful man in China. But the real challenge began in 1958 with Mao's Great Leap Forward, a delusional plan to rapidly industrialize China that instead triggered one of the greatest famines in human history, killing millions. Deng, witnessing the devastation, chose reality over ideology. As the plan failed and Mao's popularity plummeted, the chairman made a tactical retreat, stepping down as president in 1959. Deng, alongside President Liu Shaoqi, began a quiet surgery to save the economy. It worked. It saved China from collapse. But it also planted a seed of deep resentment in Mao's heart. A resentment that was about to plunge China into its darkest decade: the Cultural Revolution. The 1960s were a decade of absolute terror for Deng. Mao, determined to reclaim total control, launched the Cultural Revolution, a movement officially designed to purge bourgeois culture, but in reality, it was a weapon to eliminate Mao's political rivals. Deng Xiaoping was one of the first targets. Deng was labeled a capitalist roader, an enemy of the revolution. He was stripped of every office. The Red Guards, fanatical young students mobilized by Mao, surrounded his home. In a moment of sheer brutality, they threw his son, Deng Pufang, from the 3rd-floor window of a building at Peking University. Pufang survived, but he was paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Deng himself was erased from the world he helped build. He was exiled to a remote village to work as a common laborer in a tractor factory. The man who was once the second most powerful person in a nation of millions was now tightening bolts covered in grease and smoke. Historians say that during this long silence, Deng never once complained. Every day he walked the path from his small hut to the factory. In his mind, he wasn't just fixing machines. He was mapping out a future for China where rationality would never again be sacrificed at the altar of ideological madness. But by 1973, the madness had brought China to a dead end. The economy was paralyzed, and the chaos of the Cultural Revolution had drained the nation's soul. It was then that Zhou Enlai, the clever and veteran premier, stepped in. Zhou was dying of cancer and knew his time was short. He convinced a fading Mao that they needed Deng's management skills to pull the country out of the abyss. This was Deng's second return. He was recalled from exile to Beijing and once again sat in the vice premier's chair. Deng immediately began surgery on the broken system. But the peace was fragile. The shadows of the radicals, the Gang of Four, were still looming over him, waiting for the moment to strike again. That moment came in January 1976 with the death of his protector, Zhou Enlai. With Zhou gone, the radicals moved in for the final kill. They convinced a dying Mao that Deng was the mastermind behind the spontaneous protests in Tiananmen Square. The blow was swift. For the third time, Deng Xiaoping was purged from all his posts and placed under house arrest. At 71 years old, it seemed this would be the final fall of the unsinkable giant. But only 5 months later, the earth shook. September 1976. Mao Zedong, the man who had ruled the souls of 1 billion people for 30 years, was dead. But behind the massive state funeral, China is a wreck. China was now a giant that had forgotten how to walk, and in the shadows of the funeral, a secret war for the soul of the nation was about to begin. People are queuing for months for a pair of shoes or a few kilos of rice. The nation is an aging giant, and the world is asking, will China continue Mao's bloody revolution or find a way out? Inside the walls of Shanghai, the heart of power in Beijing, a secret war began. On one side, the Gang of Four, led by Mao's widow, Jiang Qing. Their motto was insane. Socialist weeds are better than capitalist wheat. They believed it was better for the people to starve in a pure communist system than to prosper in a mixed one. On the other side was Hua Guofeng, Mao's hand-picked successor. He was loyal, but he lacked the genius of the man waiting in the shadows. In October 1976, a lightning coup struck. The Gang of Four was arrested in the middle of the night. The people danced in the streets, not for the end of communism, but for the end of the terror. But the generals knew that without Deng Xiaoping, China would never be stable. In July 1977, the unsinkable giant returned for the third and final time. He was no longer just a politician. He was a living legend. Deng moved to strip Hua Guofeng of his power, but he didn't use a gun. He used an idea. He declared, "Seek truth from facts, not in books." It was a direct attack on Maoist dogma. Deng was saying, if Mao's policies left people hungry, then those policies were wrong. It was the first time a communist leader dared to place performance over prophecy. By December 1978, at the historic Third Plenum, Deng became the paramount leader. He didn't need a fancy title. He had the influence. While the leaders in Beijing debated, 18 desperate farmers in the tiny village of Zhaogang made a decision that changed history. In a mud hut, they secretly signed a contract to divide their collective land and farm for themselves. This was capitalist treason, a crime punishable by death. They signed with their own blood, swearing that if one was executed, the others would raise his children. When word reached Beijing, the radicals screamed for blood. But Deng stood his ground. He said, "Let them do it." The result was a miracle. Within 1 year, that starving village produced more grain than all the surrounding villages combined. Deng used this success to launch his most famous strategy. It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. If a capitalist method could feed the people, Deng would use it. He announced the 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, national defense, and science. He told his people, backwardness is not socialism. Deng had shifted China's priority from fighting imaginary enemies to building real infrastructure. But to reach his goals, he needed the one thing Mao had taught him to hate: the West. January 1979. Just weeks after cementing his power, Deng Xiaoping made a gamble that shocked the world. He became the first leader of communist China to set foot on American soil. For decades, Chinese propaganda had called America a paper tiger and an imperialist devil. Now, Deng was shaking hands with the very enemy Mao had taught him to hate. Deng was looking for oxygen for his dying economy. He visited NASA, toured Boeing's massive hangars, and watched Ford's assembly lines with the precision of an engineer. His advisors remember him being quiet, taking endless notes. He had felt the crushing gap between Western technology and Chinese backwardness. He told his circle, "We must learn from our enemies so that we no longer have to fear them." But returning to Beijing was the hard part. He couldn't open China all at once. The radicals were waiting to scream treason. He needed a laboratory. In 1980, he created the Special Economic Zones. He chose a tiny, poor fishing village called Shenzhen. Here, the rules of communism were suspended. Foreign companies could build factories, hire workers, and export to the world. When hardliners complained he was selling China's soul, Deng replied with cold logic. When you open the window for fresh air, a few flies and mosquitoes are bound to come in. The experiment was a staggering success. Shenzhen transformed from a village into a forest of skyscrapers in just years. Foreign capital flooded in. Deng had discovered the secret formula: the iron discipline of communism mixed with the capitalist hunger for profit. He introduced a new slogan that was pure heresy in the communist world: "To get rich is glorious." He taught his people that poverty was not a revolutionary virtue, it was a national humiliation. Deng knew that if he couldn't feed 800 million peasants, the system would burn. He abolished Mao's people's communes and allowed families to rent land and sell their surplus for profit. In just 5 years, 200 million people were saved from absolute starvation. But as the doors of the economy opened, the doors of new ideas opened too. Students began asking a dangerous question. If we can be like the West in our economy, why can't we be like them in our politics? But Deng faced a paradox. He believed that without the iron fist of the party, China would slide back into chaos and civil war. Deng cemented the Chinese model: free markets under absolute one-party rule. As early as the late 70s, during the Beijing Spring, a lone voice challenged the party's limits. Wei Jingsheng, an electrician, posted a manifesto titled "The Fifth Modernization." He argued that without democracy, Deng's 4 modernizations were nothing but a lie. Deng's answer was swift. Wei was sentenced to 15 years in prison, drawing a clear line. Economic reform was welcome, but political reform was treason. At the same time, while clamping down on political dissent, Deng launched the most controversial social engineering project in human history to curb population growth: the one-child policy. In 1979, fearing that a population explosion would swallow all economic gains, he dictated that every family could have only one child. It was a brutal entry of the state into the most private corners of life, using financial rewards, heavy fines, and even forced abortions to ensure that order and stability were maintained at any cost. The explosion happened in the spring of 1989. The death of a beloved reformist leader brought thousands of students into Tiananmen Square. They were tired of inflation, corruption, and the lack of a voice. Inside the halls of power, leaders were divided. But the 84-year-old Deng looked at the scene with fury. He saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and vowed that the Communist Party of China would not follow Gorbachev into the abyss. He told his generals, "We cannot retreat. If we take even one step back, the dam will burst and we will all be swept away." On the night of June 3rd, Deng signed the order for martial law. By the dawn of June 4th, the world woke up to images of tanks in the heart of Beijing. The Chinese model was set in stone: free markets under absolute one-party rule. He placed General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who had sympathized with the students, under house arrest for the rest of his life, proving that the survival of the system was more important than any international prestige. Despite international sanctions, Deng had one last move. In 1992, at the age of 87, he went on his famous Southern tour. He proved that he didn't need a formal title to lead. He was the Sultan in the shadows. He issued warnings that shook the leadership in Beijing. Anyone who opposes reform must step down. And development is the only hard truth. He put the train of the Chinese economy back on its tracks, and this time, he pushed the speed to infinity. Deng Xiaoping passed away in February 1997 at the age of 92. He died just months before seeing Hong Kong return to China, a deal he himself had engineered with the one country, two systems formula. His legacy is the China we see today, a global giant, the second largest economy on Earth, a nation that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But this progress was built on the unwritten social contract Deng engineered. The state provides wealth and security, and in exchange, the people surrender their political voice. What is your perspective on Deng Xiaoping and his economic reforms? Do you believe his model, combining political dictatorship with economic capitalism, can truly work in the long run? Or is it a house of cards? Every story has two sides, and the truth usually lies somewhere in the shadows. We want to hear your perspective. Join the discussion in the comments below. If this profile gave you a new perspective, support our mission with a like and share. Thank you for being part of the Profile community. Until next time, stay curious.